In this lesson, we will discuss biracial identity in the United States and how it is portrayed in mainstream Hollywood film. One of the most racist acts in American history was slavery. During slavery, black women were property and, as such, used as sexual objects for white slave masters. Sexual relations between black men and white women were forbidden. White women were to be kept pure, while white men could act without restrictions. Scientific racism argued for the purity of races. Whites needed to keep themselves pure of black blood for fear of dilution. In alignment with the ideals of scientific racism was the whites' new term for people of mixed descent, mulattoes. Continuing the succession of racism, those of mixed racial heritage were believed to be morally and physically inferior to pure blacks, prone to diseases and sterile like mules. Even as this racist idea spread quickly throughout the ever-growing country, a small number of biracials were being born. A small percentage of black-white biracial children were even born to white mothers and slave fathers. To keep the races separated and promote racial purity, strict laws were created so that free white men, or women who married blacks, were negatively sanctioned through fines, imprisonment, or servitude. Blacks and whites who intermarried were banished from the colony of Virginia. By 1705, interracial couples who married were sent to prison for 6 months. However, biracial people did serve a purpose for whites. In the lower South, biracial people were considered a different caste from blacks. Those who had the lightest skins had the most privilege granted by whites. They were considered to be and treated as a buffer class between whites and blacks. This especially benefited plantation owners. Blacks significantly outnumbered them, and plantation owners were fearful of a slave uprising. The mixed-race class provided a shield to this uprising. During slavery, light-skinned blacks, generally black-white biracial individuals, were given more privileges than dark-skinned blacks. Black-white biracial individuals were usually children of the plantation master and worked in the house, whereas dark-skinned blacks labored in the fields. However, after the Civil War, the privileged black-white biracial individuals no longer had the distinction of freedom to distinguish themselves from dark blacks. The black-white biracial elite wanted to maintain their status, so they began to segregate themselves into separate clubs, associations, and communities. Russell Cole, Wilson, and Hall argued that policies such as the paper bag, comb, and door tests were used to maintain the old hierarchy. This stratified the black community into a small, light-skinned elite, a brown middle class, and a black proletariat. Light skin was highly valued in the black community, but to be nearly white was not looked highly upon. Blacks wanted to be light, not white. The one-drop rule is still used to define who is black. Because of this concept's importance, its meaning and historical context must be addressed. The one-drop rule is unique only to the United States. Massoud contends that society is arranged in such a way that if any person has one drop of black or biracial blood, then that person is black and loses all privileges of whiteness. This includes individuals who have origins that are more European than African, and those who could pass for white because of the fairness of their skin. The one-drop rule is an oppressive tool used to maintain and protect whiteness. The slave trading society created the one-drop rule as a means to determine the race of children who came from interracial relationships during slavery. The one-drop rule was created to increase the number of slaves. Race was determined through paternal heritage, and this presented a problem for the new, quickly growing colonies, which benefited from slave labor. They required a never-ending fresh supply of slaves, but most fathers of biracial children were white. To remedy this problem, the status of biracial children was determined by law in 1662 to be of the maternal line, which was black, and thus the children had greater chance of becoming a slave. However, this created yet another problem. Children of white women and black men would have the status of free according to this law. To correct this issue, laws of social conduct were enforced to ensure that the races were kept separate. Abby Ferber argues that the one-drop rule was used for the purpose of maintaining white purity. Jim Crow strengthened the effectiveness of the one-drop rule and its ability to define who was black. Whites perpetuated the one-drop rule, and the black community reinforced it by using it to their advantage. To garner more rights, biracial individuals identified as black during the Civil Rights era to combat Jim Crow segregation. During this time, many blacks embraced black pride and felt that biracial people should identify themselves as black. Biracial people felt pressure to identify themselves as such. Both whites and blacks agreed with the one-drop rule. Whites did not accept those who were not white, and light skin was no longer in fashion. Every person with the one drop of black with African blood was black regardless of skin tone. At this time, fine features and straight hair were out of fashion. Afros and African features were popular. To fit into the new paradigm of beauty, biracial people had to prove their blackness. Biracial individuals who did not regard themselves as black were thought to portray and reject their black ancestry. The Civil Rights Movement was an example and catalyst for the multiracial movement. The multiracial movement began in the 1990s. The multiracial movement was an initiative of parents of multiracial children to have their children recognized by all their racial and ethnic backgrounds instead of other, with the proposed attempt to include the addition of a multiracial category to the 2000 U.S. Census. Multiracial advocates argue that multiracial people have experiences that monoracial people may never have, and because of their identities should be validated by having a category that signifies this. Multiracial advocates contend that the addition of a multiracial category will allow for equity in the area of race relations, alleviate the psychological oppression related to choosing one parent's racial background over another, or forcing a multiracial person to make an authentic choice, and to provide a more accurate picture of contemporary demographics. Most ambitiously, multiracial activists propose that the inclusion of a multiracial category will help deconstruct the concept of race and the power and privileges it connotes. This new shift in categorizing people into racial groups has moved from an either-or paradigm to a both-and paradigm. Having a multiracial category will legitimize an identity that was once considered ambiguous. These reasons did not result in a multiracial category. Instead, a mark that all apply option has been available to the U.S. Census since 2000. Multiracial advocates contend that some multiracial individuals may not define themselves with monoracial categories, and a multiracial category would better capture a more accurate personal identity. Russell, Wilson, and Hall suggest that some multiracial people may feel marginalized by choosing other as a racial designation, and some may not believe in racial categorization at all. By having only monoracial groups to choose from, the multiracial individual may be forced to choose between his or her parents' racial backgrounds. Some argue that multiracial people should and will identify with their minority parents' culture. This is not always the case, as the minority group may not fully accept the multiracial person. Russell and Wilson and Hall suggest that multiracial people may not decide their personal identity based on appearance alone, but on other factors such as neighborhood composition, the culture that he or she was predominantly raised in, racial background of his or her friendship group, and acceptance of others as a legitimate member. Some argue that categories on the U.S. Census essentialized racial identity. The U.S. Bureau of the Census is used to measure the various categories of race in the United States. The definition that the Census Bureau uses to measure race changes depending on the general population's definition of race. For instance, beginning in 1850, the U.S. Census employed the term mulatto, and later, in the 1890s, the terms quadroon and octoroon were used. Presently, the definition of black used by the Census Bureau is the nation's cultural and legal definition, all persons with any known black ancestry. An addition of a mark that apply option did not significantly change the percentage of minority groups. Only 6.8 million, or 2.4%, of the U.S. population labeled themselves as multiracial by selecting more than one racial group. According to the 2010 U.S. Census, about 9 million individuals, or 2.9% of the population, identified as two or more races. Of this population, 20.4% are black and white ancestry. The meaning of race becomes nebulous when considering people of mixed descent. Categories become blurred when attempting to fit biracial people into them. A biracial individual's phenotype often puts questions to others' minds such as, "What are you?" And if you had to choose one race, which one would you choose? These are questions that every biracial and multiracial person has pondered at some point in his or her life. To help answer these questions, researchers have conducted studies on biracial identity formation and how biracial individuals fit into society. Appiah explains identification as a process through which a person shapes his or her life with the use of available labels or identities. Racial identity is important because racial identity is related to racial attitudes. In addition, racial identities are cultural scripts that shape the actions and behaviors of the person holding a particular racial identity. Identity as biracial has another component that needs consideration: validation. Rockmore and Brunsma argue that individuals cannot have a realized identity without others who validate that identity. Racial identity validation occurs when others accept a person's constructed racial identity as legitimate. Racial identity validation is likely to occur when there is a high concentration of biracial and multiracial people and where the multiracial individual finds community and support. The pressure for biracial people to choose a race may be due to the United States being a dichotomous, white-black stratified society. How members of society identify who is biracial is contingent first upon how race is understood. Choosing a race is a very difficult task for a biracial individual because they feel as though they are members of both groups, yet not part of either group. Multiracial people may have some restrictions when selecting a racial designation for themselves because they have to justify their identity choices not only for themselves, but also for society. Many monoracial people are challenged to consider that a monoracial person is free from oppressive rules of classification. Monoracial people may not understand this because a multiracial person's experiences do not fit his or her own. Unlike monoracial people, multiracial individuals may have more incentive when designating their own racial label. First, they must successfully integrate all heritages and identifications while also developing a positive self-concept and a sense of competence. Second, they must develop the ability to incorporate their early identifications into a coherent and stable sense of personal identity, as well as a positive racial identity. Scholars have theorized how individuals develop racial identities and how racial identities have changed throughout history. However, there is no one correct, all-encompassing explanation about how and why individuals have racial identities. Appiah contends that the study of racial identity is important because the ability to map the history of a label and its consequences. In addition, race can be used to treat people differently. Racial identities have implied social effects. Lewis asserts that identity is not an individual project. Attention must be given to power and structural forces that create social groups and the distribution of scarce resources to those groups. In addition, racial identities are cultural scripts that shape the actions, type of person, and behavior of a person can present according to that label. For those multiracial people whose physical appearance leaves them racially ambiguous, questions about which group they identify with put them under constant pressure, especially when they feel that whoever is asking the question is looking for a particular answer. One side of the question is quickly answered. Since the biracial person looks ambiguous, surely he or she could not possibly be white. Although a biracial person can be culturally white, his or her appearance signals to others that this is not the case. Social class is an additional component that affects how people perceive biracial individuals and how biracial individuals racially identify. Biracial individuals living in middle and upper class environments are more likely to be perceived as biracial rather than black than those living and working in lower class environments. However, regardless of socioeconomic status, dark-skinned biracial individuals are likely to be recognized as being black. Thorin contends that race is no longer perceived only by the one-drop rule, but also by skin color and situational factors such as culture and class. Rockmore and Brumsma argued that biracial individuals were more likely to identify with a racial group closer to their social status. Biracial individuals in social environments consisting of fewer minority group members will more likely identify with their non-minority parents' racial group. Biracial individuals in social contexts consisting primarily of minority group members were more likely to identify with their minority parents' racial identity. Historically, if biracial actors played biracial characters, it was usually in the form of the tragic mulatto. The tragic mulatto is a character torn to the point of derangement between his desire to be white and the certainty that society regarded him as black. Mixed-race people were perceived to be degenerate, uncivilized progeny who were unable to reproduce. Films displaying this stereotype include Lost Boundaries, Pinky, Imitation of Life, for example. In these films, the mulatto woman represented as the possession of features of European standards and beauty, and exoticism of the other, was adored for her beauty but tormented by her mixed race status, which was deemed as just punishment. Hollywood is color-struck and perpetuates colorism. Hollywood has a preference for light skin. Russell, Wilson, and Hall contend that dark-skinned black actors are rarely hired because dark skin is hard to photograph. The strong lighting used in filming flattens out subtle shapes and facial features. In addition, many light-skinned actresses are mixed-race black women with European features. So they land more roles than dark-skinned actresses because they are perceived as being more attractive. Vogel explains that Hollywood divided black actresses into two camps. Actresses with dark skin played characters described as unattractive mammies. Actresses who became leads or stars usually possess features similar to Eurocentric ideals of beauty. These women had straight hair, fine features, and light skin. Positive portrayals of light-skinned black characters and negative portrayals of dark-skinned characters in movies support colorism by spreading images that reinforce negative racial stereotypes. American women are bombarded with images and messages that demand a really achievable standard of beauty. However, African American women and other women of color have even less of a chance of achieving the standard because they are not white. According to Mask, actresses of color are judged according to European standards of beauty. Actresses who are privileged enough to have long, straight, flowing locks, fine features, and light skin may be acceptable as the love interest of the leading man. Nevertheless, she is often regulated to African American roles. Another issue concerning skin color and privilege is passing. Those who sacrificed their blackness for the privileges of whiteness were engaging in passing. Passing occurred when light-skinned African Americans, due to the one-drop rule, tried to infiltrate white society and destroy the boundaries between whiteness and blackness. Light-skinned African Americans passing for white may not have done so because they desired to destroy the color line. It was mainly about the opportunity to possess the privileges of whiteness. Those passing for white sacrificed their families, their history, and their identities in exchange for freedom and more opportunities. One definite requirement needed to pass as white was white or nearly white skin. White or light skin not only enabled some African Americans to pass, it gave those who stayed in the African American communities more privileges and power as well. Mixed-race individuals attract media attention because it brings memories of miscegenation to life. Although interracial relationships are accepted more today, they're seen as threatening to the status quo. Once biracial individuals gained visibility in media, the representations created a reality that promoted the ideology of white power holders. When one group imposes an identity on another group, they forced a group to internalize their inferior position and domination by the superior group. The subordinate group is then complicit in their position. Since vilifying the progeny of interracial sex protects whiteness, Hollywood, like the general society, does not validate a biracial identity. Many stereotypes labeled upon African Americans originated with D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation. This film is a depiction of past times in the rural South when African Americans were migrating to a new life in the urban centers of the North. Birth of a Nation is considered the first epic film filled with strife and overt racism that has yet to be eradicated. Some of the stereotypes that have endured from this film include the Tom, Coon, Mammy, Buck, and tragic mulatto. Smith argues that Griffith went to great efforts to convince his audience that the history and future portrayed in Birth of a Nation was accurate. Birth of a Nation's release during the height of the Jim Crow era justified segregation, lynching, and Klan violence. The Birth of a Nation is said to have reflected and at the same time created American ideologies concerning race in the early 19th century. The actors who play the Tom, Coons, Mammies, Buck, and tragic mulattoes in the film were white instead of African American. Nevertheless, these stereotypes validated society's expectation of African Americans. One of the major themes running through Birth of a Nation was white Americans' fear of interracial sexuality. In particular, the great fear was of a strong sexual black man or buck. White women were defined by what they were not, African American. White women were virginal goddesses, while African American women were oversexed, animalistic breeders. The white women symbolized white racial purity, one of Griffith's major tropes. Biracial individuals may have been othered due to the contribution of the media, specifically film. Images of the tragic mulatto can first be seen in The Birth of a Nation. Smith contends that the mulatto is the closest to the white ideal. The white woman was to be kept untouched and pure, but the mulatto was close enough to Eurocentric beauty standards and was sexually available because of her tainted blood. Griffith's portrayal of women has influenced how women are portrayed today. White women are still prized. Black women, especially with dark skin, can be used and discarded. Black women, especially with mulatto, are the occasional acceptable sexual second-place prize. Some major themes found in classic film with tragic mulattoes can be found in contemporary film, and they are issues of passing, colorism, general stereotypes of the tragic mulatto, and the one-drop rule. These recurring themes suggest that racial imagery and racial ideologies are difficult to dismantle. Mask argues that although biracial actors may be able to portray a multitude of ethnicities, they are not always given that opportunity because of Hollywood's adherence to the one-drop rule. One pattern often found in Hollywood film is that biracial individuals who are part African American and some other race or ethnicity typically play African American characters, not a wide variety of races and ethnicities. These African American characters played by biracial actors are perpetuations of stereotypes found throughout American film history. Biracial men are often depicted as criminals, and biracial women are portrayed as deceitful and sexually promiscuous. Positive portrayals of light-skinned black and biracial characters and negative portrayals of dark-skinned characters support colorism. They also work to uphold the present racial hierarchy. Disproportionate portrayals of black characters as negative support and help spread harmful racial stereotypes, while at the same time, colorblind portrayals of middle and upper-class black and biracial characters support the notion that race no longer matters, at least for middle and upper-class people. Even though American citizens can choose one or more races to indicate their racial background, Hollywood has not replicated this reality. There have been a few films that specifically features a biracial character. Rarely is the racial identity of that character an essential part of the film. One exception is Mixinilla. This film was released 2 years before the option of choosing one or more races was included on the U.S. Census. Mixinilla is a fictionalized story of one biracial woman's exploration of her racial identity. In this film, discussions of interracial relationships, what it means to be black, and self-acceptance are addressed. Again, films addressing biracial identity are rare.